Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the towering Soviet dissident, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, wrote of the persecution that Christians endured under the brutal Soviet gulags in Siberia. He told about Dr. Boris Kornfeld, who was a Jew, who converted to Christianity in prison. Dr. Kornfeld ministered to Solzhenitsyn during his stomach ailment. And in that time, he was witnessing to him. Kornfeld said of the suffering he was undergoing in prison for being a Christian, "It was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Bless you, prison, for having been my life." That night, the guards took after Dr. Kornfeld with a plasterer's hammer, and they beat him to death with it. To the believer, suffering purifies. Suffering purifies, but also suffering is the proof. Suffering is proof. Verse 13, the first part, "But rejoice inasmuch as ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings." Ye are partakers of Christ's sufferings. This tells us that what we suffer is not merely ours, but it is also Christ's. And it is proof that He is ours, and it is proof that we are His. I've spoken before about the gloriously defiant Romanian preacher, Joseph Sohn, who dared preach against communism when it was at its absolute oppressive height in Romania. He spent his entire ministry daring Ceausescu to martyr him. He would not be silenced. He wrote this, quote, "This union with Christ is the most beautiful subject in the Christian life. It means that I am not a lone fighter here. I am an extension of Jesus Christ. When I was beaten in Romania, He suffered in my body. It is not my suffering. I only had the honor to partake of His sufferings." We can rejoice in suffering because to suffer for Christ means to suffer with Christ, and for Christ to suffer with us. It is proof that we are His. It is proof that He is ours. Suffering purifies, suffering is proof, and suffering carries with it a promise. Second part of verse 13, "When His glory shall be revealed, ye may be glad also with exceeding joy." First there is the suffering, then there is the glory. There's a promise. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 11. "The Spirit of Christ testified beforehand the sufferings of Christ and the glory that should follow." Romans 8:17, Paul says, "If so be that we suffer with Him, that we may be also glorified." What does all that mean? Well, in this case, to best understand what it means, it's best to consider the opposite. Okay, the opposite of rejoicing in suffering for the glory to come is not indifference toward it. It's not ambivalence over it. The opposite of rejoicing and suffering is to become bitter in suffering. And what is bitterness? Well, bitterness is what results, by definition, spiritually speaking, bitterness is what results when we deny, ignore, or refuse to see the value, the reason, the benefit of that which we're going through. We become bitter when we blind ourselves to what it means for God's glory. If we are embittered, that means, friends, we discount His promise of exceeding joy to come with his coming. We discount his promise that our suffering may come first, but his glory, friends, is coming after. And Christ keeps his promises. When we become bitter in our suffering, we deny the promises of Christ. This should not be. Believers, we all believers can rejoice in suffering because it purifies. It is the proof that he is ours and we are his. It carries with it the promise of coming glory, and also because of the peace. First part of verse 14, if ye be reproached for the name of Christ, happy are ye, for the Spirit of glory and of God resteth upon you. Now we can rejoice in suffering as believers because he is going to respond with his presence and his love and his comfort. The hotter the fires, the more he inspires. The moment of our most difficult trial will also be, by God's grace, if we permit it, the moment of our worst and most difficult trial will be also the moment of his most extravagant consolation. You'll never know how deeply the Spirit can love you and tend to your needs until you suffer. Until you suffer for him and with him. Charles Spurgeon, the great preacher, said that all the grace and good he knew in times of comfort and ease and in happy hours, all the grace from those times could fit on a penny. But the good he received from suffering could not be calculated. He said, quote, "We never have such close dealings with God as when we are in tribulation. When troubles abound, they drive us to God, and then God's consolations abound." Samuel Rutherford said this, quote, "The great king keeps his finest wine in the cellar of affliction." I like how John Piper explains it. If you say, "What is this?" meaning the suffering, the Spirit of glory and of God resting on me in suffering, the answer is simply this: you will find out when you need it. You want to know what it means to be comforted by God in this way. When you suffer, you will find out. The Spirit will reveal enough of glory and enough of God to satisfy and console your wounded heart and will carry you through. So seek to be holy. Seek to bring truth. Seek to bear witness. And do not turn aside from risk. And sooner or later, you will experience the Spirit of glory and of God resting on you in your suffering. Purification, promise, proof, peace, and praise. The suffering of believers causes us to praise God, and when God is praised, he is glorified. Verse 16, "Yet if any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God on this behalf." What does it mean for us to glorify God? It means that in what we say, and equally importantly, what we do and think, we reveal that God is glorious and most highly esteemed and is adored by us. And this, of course, makes it meaningful when he blesses us. Of course, I'm not denying the meaning and the value of his blessings, especially with a view toward how others see it. And I'll explain.